Welcome to Athletes OnBalance, where we talk to athletes, coaches, and experts about mental health and sports. This is a stigma-free zone for inner thoughts and outer conversations. We're helping athletes and anyone with mental health challenges perform at their best, on and off the field.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Athletes OnBalance. I'm your host, Walt, the founder and CEO of OnBalance Health. Today, I'm honored to be joined by two leaders who have had an enormous impact in college athletics and the entire sports community, both on and off the field. Former University of Alabama football coach Nick Saban, the GOAT, and Dr. Brian Hainline, former NCAA chief medical officer and a globally recognized leader in athlete mental health and sports medicine. For those who have been under a rock for the last 10 years, Coach Saban has won more national championships in NCAA history with 7, 6 with the Tide and 1 with the LSU Tigers. As impressively as an old SEC football player, 8 SEC championships in his 16 seasons at Alabama. Since retiring last January, he is an analyst with ESPN's Game Day, which I believe is a tremendous show, and I think one of the best commercials on TV, which I still laugh at every time, which doesn't say much about me, with VRBO, and of course with Deion Sanders with Aflac. Coach and I go way back. He recruited me to play ball at Ohio State 40-some years ago. Dr. Hainline has transformed how we approach athlete well-being in collegiate athletics. The former chief medical officer retired, if I believe, last May or June, Brian, having been there from 2013 to 24. And I believe the first NCAA CMO, as well as the first CMO within the United States sports, I think only behind FIFA, if I'm correct there. He's done some groundbreaking work both on the physical and mental side for student athletes, launched the Sports Science Institute, led the largest concussion study in history, and has been a global voice for athlete mental health through his work with the International Olympic Committee. He's also the past president of the USTA and a current trustee. Brian and I have gotten to know each other over the last year with some shared interests on what I'm doing with OnBalance. Welcome, Coach. Welcome, Dr. Hainline. I'm really looking forward to talking about the importance of some of the challenges that are going on in today's environment with NIL and so forth. So thank you for joining me.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So we all know we're going through some unprecedented times. What I love about having the two of you on, you have a very unique perspective on, from your different swim lanes as a coach in developing young men, specifically for the sport of football, as well as beyond that in life, which I think is one of the great attributes of you, Coach. What are the challenges that the athletes and the stakeholders that are around the athletes today, what are they facing, and why is that? And Coach, if you don't mind, I'll start with you.
Well, I think that I always sort of started with the premise, and I think Dr. Hainline and I have talked about this for many years, is talent is not talent unless you can use it. There's nothing but smart people that get into medical school, but they all don't make it. And even if they do make it, they don't all make good doctors. So why is that? What would be the reason for that? And I don't think anybody could really answer that question, but I do think that delving into how do we help people sort of reach their full potential, decrease the capability gap relative to what their talent is, to what they're capable of. That's something that always interested me. And for the last 25 years, way before anybody, even thought about, having any kind of a mental health program surrounding their players, we used psychiatrists, sports psychologists, and people who would try to help us figure out what is the best way to teach, what is the best way to develop, this particular player. And it wasn't about the physical skills of teaching them how to play bump and run or throw a football or any of that. It was, how do we create the psychological disposition that is going to help them overcome any deficiencies that they have, or help them realize their goals? So, that's something that I think helped us have more consistency and success, because we actually got more people who had talent to be able to bring that talent to fruition.
Dr. Hainline, what's your perspective on that? Thank you for that, Coach. Dr. Hainline, what's your perspective on this environment, and why the young people are going through the challenges that they are, that seem to be a growing trend as opposed to a digressing trend?
Well, I'd like to amplify on and maybe even personalize some of the things that Coach Saban was talking about. It's really clear that the environment matters, and that's a cultural issue. So you go to, for example, University of Alabama. What's the culture there in terms of nourishing these young kids who have so much potential, but that can fall by the wayside? And when we think of the environment, it's you can talk about two things. One is, if you have a really supportive environment, even athletes that have mental health conditions, they can thrive there. On the other hand, if you have an unsupportive environment, even those with no history of a mental health problem, they can languish. They can do very, very poorly. And I'll always remember when I visited University of Alabama for the first time, and look, as chief medical officer, I went around the country on roller skates, visited a few hundred schools, because I really wanted to understand what was happening at the ground level. And I remember going into Coach's office, and we had 30 minutes. We sat down. He was incredibly welcoming, and he said, "Doc, tell me everything you know about sleep." And I was just so shocked, because here's a coach, a well-known coach, and he wanted to dive into something that was on the cutting edge of what we understand impacts mental health and performance, and that's disordered sleeping. So we spoke about everything I knew about sleep, and I'm certain that Coach applied that to his program. But even more importantly, when I visited the campus, met with all of the athletic stakeholders, they had an incredible head of mental health services, Dr. Gilmore, and I understood that this just wasn't the football team. There was a culture at University of Alabama that the environment matters, that mental health matters, and mental well-being matters. And that's the starting point. You can have all of the great sports psychologists or psychiatrists in the world, but if the environment is toxic, if the coaches don't say, look, mental health matters. If you have a mental health issue, I want you to take care of that just like I want you to take care of an ankle sprain. If that's the accepted way of doing things, then the athletes thrive. Then you're in the business of human development. And so I've seen that really work well at certain institutions, and I've seen it go very, very poorly at many others.
Great commentary, Brian, because Dr. Hainline, I with my world, I have to travel around and I see a bunch of different universities and I see their programs, and there's some extremism. Alabama being at the very top of the totem pole with some others, and one particular school, and a lead academic program. They have great sports in the Power 4, Power 5 conferences, and they're very proud of the fact that at any given period of time, they have roughly 50% of the student athletes that are in some form of a non-clinical, clinical mental health case. And the reason they're proud of it, even though it seems like a very high percentage, what's going on at that place, it's the opposite. It's what you just said. There's a culture that has created essentially a safeness for these young people to go get care, no different than their shoulder and their ankle. And, within that, they feel like they're not being judged, and it's been a winning program. And there's other programs I've walked into where they're very proud of the fact that it's 10 to 15% of their and candidly, what I see when I drill down into that culture is not what you just described. So that kind of leads to, and Coach, you kind of referenced it, and Brian, I know this is a big part of your world, and that's the intersection between the mental health element, the behavioral, and the physical as it leads to performance optimization. And the sports science world I've been very impressed with as I've gotten to learn this industry. Brian, I'll start with you. What is your perspective of where that intersection is today, and where do you think it's going that, again, leads to improvement, with the well-being of that athlete as well as, maximizing their competitive capabilities?
Well, the intersection is just so profound. We must understand that physical and mental health are inseparable. They're intertwined at every level of our physiology. And so we know with certainty, for example, that mental health disorders can predict physical injuries. We know disordered sleeping predicts a musculoskeletal injury more than overtraining does. We know that if you have an injury and in the recovery phase, you become clinically depressed or develop an anxiety disorder, that's going to prolong your recovery. Even after surgery, this is really interesting. You can have a torn ACL and have perfectly reconstructed biomechanically ACL repair. But if you develop a clinical depression postoperatively, that predicts that the ACL will not take. Just think about that. From a performance point of view, we know that mental wellness and will predict better performance, and mental health disorders predict poor performance. So once we started sharing that data with coaches, and the one thing I understood, coaches, I believe, it's understood that they really are the individuals who have so much to do with shaping our athletes. And my understanding in meeting with so many coaches is that they deeply care about their athletes. But coaches are also data-driven. And when we started sharing with the coaches these facts, these statistics, I think that opened up the world for coaches embracing mental health care seeking, mental wellness, and really becoming involved with the licensed mental health providers as well as the clinicians who take care of physical injuries, ensuring that all of that is addressed. Those are the data-driven coaches who are doing the best.
Nick, you and I had a conversation about this. Thank you, Brian. I didn't know this all the years that you got interested in this intersection between the mind and the body a long time ago. And if I recall, it was right after you took your first head coaching position. Where did that interest come from? Is that something that you had as a young person and then it just evolved, or is that something to do with your academic studies?
When I was a graduate assistant, I actually got a master's degree with a concentration in sports psychology, which is something that I was interested in but didn't know really a lot about. And just taking something which, Dr. Hainline just mentioned, we did a study on how anxiety and achievement motivation and the combination of those two things being in the correct balance affected performance, which was, kind of intriguing to me that first time I ever looked at things as if, the mental side of what's happening internally with you has a lot to do with how you perform. And so that was the start of it. And then as I coached through the years with the multiple differences in personalities that you deal with at every position, I always was a defensive back coach and defensive coordinator, but it played quarterback. So I always had an interest in what really makes this guy tick and what is an issue that may be holding him back. Like we had numerous guys that had sleep apnea that, really affected their academic performance as well as, their ability to perform, on the football field. And just by remedying that one thing to see how they improved their performance academically as well as on the field was, really sort of compelling to see what a big change that this one little thing, sleep apnea and treating sleep apnea and sleeping properly. Dr. Hainline mentioned our conversation about this years ago could impact an athlete. Well, that's just one example, anxiety, sleep apnea. But a lot of these things, learning disabilities, you know, uh, attention deficit, being able to sit in a meeting and be able to pay attention as an athlete. We're going to have a meeting, we're going to present what we do, we're going to go demonstrate it, we're going to have, some kind of way you imitate it, and then we do repetitions. But if you miss that first part in the meeting because you can't pay attention, um, you're going to be behind the eight ball the rest of the learning curve. So all these things sort of through the years, and it wasn't an exact science. So I don't think that anybody should think that hey, you can just walk up to somebody and figure all this out. But I think you figure out little details along the way that you treat that can help people perform better. And going back to the culture piece that you talked about before, when we first started this, and you wanted players to talk to somebody, whether it was a psychiatrist or whoever, their first reaction was, there's nothing wrong with me. And, but as guys improved their performance because of some of the things that we were able to identify that were issues psychologically or mentally, then more people were willing to say, well, I don't see this as somebody looking at me like I've got something wrong with me. They looked at it like this is an opportunity for me to develop if I, use these resources. So that culture piece is really, really important because one of the things that, people have a hard time admitting I have a problem here. I need to improve. That's a tough hurdle for some folks, to get over. An example that I always use, and I use it with some players, is I visited a Mercedes plant in Tuscaloosa, and they had this, sort of clothesline looking thing that ran through the whole plant in terms of the assembly line. And I said, wow, why do you do that? And they said, well, if anybody on the line doesn't have perfect fitting part or whatever their responsibility is, they're supposed to pull the cord, stop the line, so we fix it so we don't make a whole bunch of cars that have a flaw. And I said, oh man, that's a great idea. What's the biggest issue? Getting people to pull the cord because nobody wants to admit what they're responsible for has a problem because they think it's a reflection of them. So I always use that as an example of how do we have to create a culture, right, that allows people to come forward when they have an issue or a problem that we could help them with.
Yeah, that's an interesting. That's actually just an interesting business model, but it translates into a lot of different sectors. Let me stay on that for both of you, because I'll go to the culture, I'll go to the coaches, and again, I don't have the years and exposure that the two of you have, but I'm getting my dosage. That intersection. So some coaches and some cultures, to your point, Dr. Hainline, embrace it. I can't speak to why. Maybe they're just more educated and have had. Maybe they've seen some data or they've seen the results on the court, the field, or the pool. But in the places where the ecosystem, I'll go specifically to a coach, and maybe that goes to the health and wellness part of the athletic department as well. This line that is there between, and it kind of speaks to what you just said, Coach, of accountability and admitting a weakness, of that line of mental toughness within athletics and pushing through it. Dr. Hainline, you've got a great tennis background. And it doesn't really matter the sport. Athletes, strong-minded, disciplined, work ethic, infallible to some degree in terms of the mentality, certainly the perception a lot of people have of them. That's, to me, there's the subjectivity of what goes on in the mental health world. How does that kind of get vetted out between a coach, pushing the needle and stepping back and saying, kind of like the physical injury you spoke to, Dr. Hainline, which is, the ankle, right? Where do you push through the ankle, and where do you say, you know what, I got to back off and I got to get treated? How does that work today? Dr. Hainline, I'll start with you.
Well, going back to process and so forth. So in the physical world, what's really important is biomechanics. So if you're looking at any athlete, we look at something called the kinetic chain continuum. How is your body really working from the ground forces all the way up to, say a football quarterback, how they're delivering the throw? And if you see that something is really impeding the performance from a kinetic chain point of view, a biomechanical point of view, you address that, and it's normalized. So what is increasingly becoming normalized is that if there's something interfering with the processing of how you're performing, how you're thinking, how you're looking at yourself, we can use an analogy that's almost like a kinetic chain too. If I don't have self-trust, if I'm really processing in such a way that I'm always forgetting because I'm sleep deprived, or that I can't really keep attention because I have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that's breaking down the process just like it's breaking down from a kinetic chain point of view, biomechanically, physically. So that's how we need to start thinking. So you normalize that. But part of the normalization, there's another huge cultural piece, and that's trust. Because for whatever reason, and I can go back historically when all of this started breaking down, but no reason to do that now. But for many reasons, mental health got put into this specific domain that was separate from physical health. Freud did that, actually, and that was a mistake because, again, they're really inseparable. And so if you trust the process, you trust that addressing the mental health issues is as important as the biomechanical and physical health issues, then you're willing to start working with the team. So you need to trust the coach, but you also need to trust yourself, and that you're willing to do that work. And then you also are trusting the environment that the coaches help to create, that they're really looking after your best interests as a human being, and as a human being who's pursuing excellence in human development. So those are some broad things, but I think also what's increasingly happening, Walt and Coach, is that we're starting to normalize this from a data gathering point of view. Again, we don't need to put mental health in some sort of cloud domain that we can't touch, that is just so separate that we never address it, or we hide it in a closet, or we just say, well, suck it up if you're not feeling good, go out there and perform. Once we start really integrating that and treating it as data like all other aspects of physical, biomechanical data, then we're going to be light years ahead of where we are today.
Well, you had mentioned something to me, and I since the two of you were involved in it, I'm going to, I think that's a good thread, which is, data intelligence to make better decisions. I mentioned earlier that I've been very impressed with, I'm a data guy, and I've been very impressed with what I've seen from the sports science world in terms of the change of how you trained, on how you rest. You mentioned the sleep situation, hydration, et cetera. Kind of when do you back off and when do you push it? And that all comes from the evolution of having that information. You were both involved. I know you spearheaded it, Dr. Hainline, with we need to get away from two-a-days, right? So two-a-days were, they've been part of the foundation of high school football, college football, NFL level forever. And you were the person that came in and advocated that they be eliminated. And I think you had mentioned that Coach was part of that discussion and agreed. But I assume you had data behind that.
Well, we did have data, and some of the data, in fact, was frightening. And so, it got a little complicated. So it's not the concepts of two-a-days per se, but the mindset of doing two-a-days is that you're driving these young kids so hard, sometimes in hot human conditions. The data were pretty clear that there were more deaths during the time of the year when we were doing two-a-days than any other time. And also when we looked at concussion injury and we looked at repetitive head impact exposure, all of that was really prominent. It was data driven. And so I remember I shared this with the then president of the NCAA, Mark Emmer, and I said, Mark, we have a problem here. And there are a lot of deaths that are happening, but other adverse consequences too. So Mark said, look, Brian, I trust you. I believe you. But if you can go to the SEC and meet with all of their football coaches and convince them of that, then I'll back you up. So I met with the SEC football coaches, and they were looking at me, and I'm not sure everyone was completely paying attention at first, but I tried to bring them in. But there's this reluctance to change what has been part of a tradition. And then finally, Coach Saban, he just said, Doc, I think you're right. And I can tell you, I remember that day like yesterday, the entire atmosphere of the room changed. And we started talking and changing the conversation about, well, then what's really a better way to approach this, not only from the point of view of the athletes and their health, but even performance. I remember Coach came to me after the meeting and said, it's not just eliminating two-a-days. We, probably need to give them a day or two off. But, if I go too far in this and don't win a national championship, people are going to be all over me. Like, why am I being so soft? So that was sort of funny too. But yeah, it's finding that balance. How do we optimize performance without hurting individuals?
Well, Coach, if you don't mind, can you expand upon that a little bit? Because obviously you were part of that process and advocating Dr. Hainline's perspective. And what were the benefits that you saw after that? Were they something that stood out, or just something that happened over time that you saw the benefits?
Well, actually, when I was at LSU before Dr. Hainline was, at the NCAA, we had two-a-days and we had 33 guys need IVs after the first two-a-day. So I said, we can't have two-a-days here. It's too hot in August. So I went to the doctors and said, what's the best time to practice? And they said 4 o'clock in the morning. I said, well, we really can't do that. So give me some alternatives. And they said, well, it's not really when you practice as much as it is if you could have two opportunities to hydrate and two opportunities to eat between practices. So if you practiced in the morning, at night, the next afternoon, you would accomplish that because you're creating a greater space between practices. So I actually went to the NCAA and said, hey, we can't have two-a-days here. We're going to do morning, night, next afternoon. Can you change and let us come in a little earlier so that we get the same number of practices, 29 before the first game? And they said, no, we can't do that. So for several years, when I was at LSU, we only practiced 26 times, I think, before the first game instead of 29. And we played pretty well. I mean, I don't think we lost any of those games. So I was a sort of a proponent of this before a lot of other people, only because of the circumstance that we were in, because of the heat and what we were dealing with at LSU. So my mindset completely changed toward this as we continue to make progress down the road in terms of how we did fall camp and how much time off we gave players, how much recovery time. And I think it was all for the best, for performance as well as injuries, as well as ability to perform. But I think the big point I'm trying to make here is both sides are reluctant to change until we could present enough data that actually convinced people that there was a better way. And I think that's always the case with coaches. They have to be convinced that this is a better way, because nobody wants to adapt, nobody wants to change. It's like we've always done it this way, so we're going to keep doing it this way, but you're also going to keep getting the same results, more injuries, more, you know, concussions, a lot of other bad things that are happening that by changing, you actually could improve the circumstances for your team and their development.
Well, the one word that keeps coming up is data. And I know, Dr. Hainline, that's foundational for you and everything you've done within your medical world, and how it's translated very successfully into the sports community. You know, there's obviously a lot of noise out there on AI, and some of it's legitimate, and some of it's not. And, you know, frankly, as a person that's, you know, involved in that world heavily, you know, cutting the noise aside, you know, myself and obviously a lot of people in AI technology in healthcare, it's probably the one area, and Dr. Hainline, I'm just going to get to you first, is probably the one area in healthcare where it's going to have the greatest impact, in my opinion and others' opinion. Mental health, as we know, it's a tricky situation. You know, when you're doing a diagnosis, assessment diagnosis, it's you know, it's not blood work, it's not CAT scans and MRIs. It's, you know, it's not even an X-ray. You know, however, there's intelligence that comes out of that gives information to, you know, enhance the perspective of the care program and the treatment program for a better outcome. Dr. Hainline, do you see a day? You know, we talked about it on the physical side. You both just described situations where data presented essentially changed the behavior for a better outcome. Do you see that happening in the future, or distance or near, on the mental health side?
Oh, absolutely. And in so many other areas too. I'll just, you know, you had mentioned at the beginning the concussion study that I helped to develop, you know, was really an architect of that. And, you know, we're tracking 55,000 service cadet members and NCAA athletes over a period of 25 years. And we're looking at mental health outcomes, well-being outcomes, and we have several million data points. We're actually working with the Department of Energy, who has just this incredible computational ability, and using AI to develop predictive algorithms of, you know, putting together brain MRIs, blood-based biomarkers, and things like social determinants of health. So how we can actually predict brain health. So AI is critical in that domain. But to the listeners, AI isn't some magical domain that all of a sudden is going to come in and solve the problems. It really relies on sound data, asking the right questions, machine learning, re-asking the right questions, analyzing the data, and AI comes in as this extra component that can do things that maybe we just weren't able to do before when we had our slide ruler, for example. I mean, we're continuing to advance. And with that in mind, with mental health, again, we've been reluctant to try to develop predictive algorithms for mental health conditions. But we've done that for physical conditions. We've done it for upper respiratory infections. We've done it for ACL injuries. We've done it for heart conditions. And we need to take the attitude that we can do that for mental health conditions as well. These are measurable, they're definable. And once we take that attitude and we're willing to, you know, not necessarily have the right answer right away, but over the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, if you can start developing those predictive algorithms, it's going to be not only helpful for the individual first and foremost, so that they understand a little bit better what their outcome is, but it's going to make a massive difference for performance, for coaches, for the whole team.
You know, I think there is a correlation between what you both said earlier on some of these changed behaviors, and I'm seeing it firsthand that you know, you have the mental health, behavioral health specialists who have been doing, like coaches you mentioned earlier, in terms of, you know, why are we changing this practice? This is the way it's been for, you know, many years and decades, and we've had success. and data showed otherwise. I think it's going to be, from where I've sat, it's going to be a process. You've got people that are going to be the early adopters, and they can see it, and they're accepting, embracing that, and then you're going to see, probably the major majority, and I'm speaking collegiate athletics, that are going to be. It's going to be Missouri. It's going to be show me, and it's going to take some period of time. I'm going to go into a closing question. You've both been highly active individuals who have recently retired, and I say that with quotation marks, who've had very successful careers. When you look back on some of the challenging times that you've had, we all do, but you guys have been playing in a big arena with a lot of profile. I think this would be interesting to our audience. So, how did you manage the stresses and pressures of the moment? We brought sleep. How did you sleep at night and keep perspective to optimize your performance? Coach, I'll start with you.
Well, a couple of things I'd like to make comment on is, the AI thing. Had an interesting conversation with Larry Ellison, who is very involved in how do we gather information through AI that's being done all over and everything that has ever been done to try to come to a better conclusion. I think that's something that we can do in mental health. I think it's something that we can do, in cancer research. And I do think AI will help us in that, because the one thing that I think we have to realize about mental health is it's not an exact science. We've been able to identify how to fix an ACL. Back when I played in 1972, that wasn't the case. But through sort of research and development, we've been able to do that. And I think AI will help us do that in mental health, because it's not an exact science. There's a lot of trial and error that goes with it. We're making progress in those areas, and hopefully we'll continue to do that. The way I dealt with stress was I was always a process-oriented person. I was not an outcome-oriented person. I think stress and anxiety come from worrying about the destination, not the journey. So every day I was always focused on what do we need to do today to do the things we need to do to get the outcome that we want. And I think that's a less, even when you go play the game, it's not about winning, it's about dominating a competition one play at a time. Well, when you approach it that way, there's a lot less anxiety because you're just focused on what you can control in that moment. And that's the way I always approached it. And not to say that there weren't times where there was anxiety, but we have all these external factors that contribute to this anxiety and expectation, which creates anxiety. I don't care if you go out and play golf. If you think you're going to shoot par today, you're putting pressure on yourself to go shoot par rather than just going out and play one shot at a time. And then what is the best score I can shoot based on that focus? And that's what I always try to do as a coach and with the players. And I wanted the players to look at it that way too, and not worry so much about winning, but not worry about being a champion or winning a championship, but focus on what do I have to do to be a champion in terms of what I do as a player day in and day out to try to perform at the highest level possible, which creates value for me personally as well as the team. So that's kind of the way I always try to do it. I think the outside influences, though, made it more and more difficult to do it because our society is always putting pressure on people to create expectations, which to me creates a lot of anxiety, which can affect performance. Just look at the basketball tournament. Both teams that lost, Duke lost the game. Houston lost the game in the final. The other team ended up winning, but did they win or did the other team lose? And what created that? I think there was a lot of anxiety at the end of that game, and people started playing not to win, but to keep from getting beat. and that affected their performance. It's the most recent example I can give you, where if they had just kept playing possession by possession, focusing on what they could control in that moment, maybe that wouldn't have happened.
Look, it makes so much sense, and being process oriented. I guess I share that trait with Coach. I approach it from this vantage point. I look at not time management, but energy management. The four spheres of energy management are physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And so those are the things I can try to control every day. And how am I eating? How am I sleeping? How am I addressing my anxiety inside? And how am I addressing things spiritually, just from the point of view of gratitude and sort of that inner creative intuition that we work with. And that's a daily discipline process. And sometimes some of my friends or colleagues, they'll make fun of me and they say, you're no discipline, you don't have any fun. And I say, well, I'm actually having a ball, and discipline really is the road to freedom. Is when you're not disciplined, that you don't have control and you don't have the choices that you have. But I'll go to one point in time where the circumstances were so intense, and I was struggling really a lot, and that was during COVID. So we made the announcement, that we were canceling the 2020 Final Four. In fact, all of the winter and spring championships, and that was a $1 billion decision. And then we came around to 2021, and if we hadn't had a Final Four, the NCAA wouldn't exist today. And I just felt so much pressure. I felt like almost the world was on my shoulders, and I just couldn't get back to that place of, managing my energy. And so I did something which may not have made sense because I was working really hard. I started piano lessons during COVID. And that sort of took care of, it was like a state of mind where I said, I'm going to play 1 hour every day, and my phone is off. I'm blocking the room. No one can interfere with what I'm doing. And that was the one thing I could control. And it actually improved my creativity, my sense of anxiety management. And it actually got not so bad over a couple of years too. But, so sometimes we have to take a step back, and when the forces are overwhelming, we have to make a strategic shift and do something else. But it's I agree with Coach. It's a day-to-day process oriented, and control what you can. But it's the journey that's magical, not the long-term outcome.
I agree. And you make an interesting point, Dr. Hainline, about um, the fact that discipline to control your emotions. Um, because if you can't control your emotions, which a lot of athletes really struggle with this, because there's a difference between high intensity level to perform and loss of control of your emotions. And when you lose control of your emotions, you basically lose control of your mind, because you can't think properly and make good choices and decisions, which goes right back to the whole discipline proposition that you talked about. Now you're going to create a bad situation, get a penalty, do something that you normally typically wouldn't do, because you're not controlling your emotions, which takes a certain amount of discipline, especially when you're an athlete.
Well, great perspectives. I appreciate both of those. Coach mentioned the golf analogy, and I got exposed at a younger age with one of the greatest golfers that ever played, and he made the exact same statement that you made, Coach, which is just one shot at a time. Don't go out and say you're going to shoot an 80. In this case it was a 65, but one shot at a time, and keep your head down and make the putt. I want to thank both of you for joining me today, and more importantly, and I mean this as I've gotten deeply embedded in your old world, and that is what you've done to help young people, both with their mental and physical well-being, and in a lot of situations their behavioral well-being, while they're competing in athletics, as well as how that carries forward into lives. Thank you both for joining me today, and more importantly, for everything you've done to help young people with their mental and physical well-being while competing, as well as how that carries on to the rest of their life. It's been an honor to discuss this important subject with the two of you who've had a profound impact on the development and the well-being of countless athletes across the country and beyond. To our listeners, thank you for being part of this conversation. At Athletes OnBalance, we're committing to breaking this stigma so that people understand it's safe to go get mental health care sooner than later, so they can get back into athletics as well as life. Be well, everyone. I'm Walt Norley, and this is Athletes OnBalance.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Athletes OnBalance. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please follow us on your preferred podcast app to catch our next episode. Join our community by sharing with an athlete, mental health care provider, or coach in your circle.